Wales. Donald Trump has invited the Russian President Vladimir Putin to visit the White House in the autumn. And the European Commission has warned all EU states to get ready for a no-deal Brexit. Hello there, you're watching the Press Preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with The Observer's chief leader writer Sonia Sodha and the editor of Westmonster.com, Michael Heaver. So let's see what's on some of those front pages now. The Metro reports that cuts to police services has resulted in an 11% year-on-year rise in serious crimes such as murder, robbery and sexual assault. While the Express reflects on those figures with the headline Lawless Britain. The Telegraph reports on comments allegedly made by the Justice Minister David Gauke that jail is not working. The Eye reports on the latest in the Novichok investigation and claims that police have now identified the suspects. It's emerged that the Bank of England carried out a viability investigation into the accounting firm KPMG after it was the subject of several scandals. That's according to the Financial Times. And we're joined tonight by Sonia Sodha and Michael Heaver. Good evening to you both. Thanks very much for being here. Crime figures out today and across many of the morning's front pages. Let's start with the Express and its headline, Lawless Britain. And it is pointing out the story that happened today about the carjacking.
God, it's every parent, must be every parent's worst nightmare. It's an absolutely hideous story. Apparently, a mother was in a car. She had a 4-week-old baby in the back. They'd stopped and the gang ordered the mother out of the car. She obviously was trying to cling onto the car. She was injured as they drove it away. And it's not quite clear from the story whether they've recovered the car with the baby in it. But I
think
hope
the baby was dropped at a health centre.
Oh, thank God. Yeah, that's the main thing, I think. Yeah. But they've obviously, it's a really shocking story and they've used it to kind of illustrate this idea of rising crime. I think, there are some really big, serious numbers here. So the annual statistics show that knife offences have soared by 16% in a year. Robberies are up by 30%, which is really very significant. But what you've got police officers out and about saying in the papers is, we did warn you this would happen to the government, after you've made all these police cuts. So we now know that police numbers are at their lowest level since they've been since 1996. We've lost over 20,000 police officers since 2010. And I think police officers are right to point to the fact that as you cut policing, as you've got fewer police officers out in the community, they do play a really important preventative role in kind of keeping law and order. People see them out and about. People know they're a kind of a trusted source, someone they can tip off in the community. If you don't have bobbies on the beat, it's inevitable that crime may well go up. We also know that crime is linked to the economy and what's happening in the economy, and growth hasn't been great of late.
Is it too simplistic to say it's just about police cuts?
Well, no, I think there's a bigger picture here in terms of jail and all the rest of it. We've got that on the front page of the Telegraph in terms of the approach to putting people in prison. But I do think, the word crisis is bandied about quite a lot. I do think this is a genuine crisis, because another statistic that was released by the Home Office today, sort of snuck out, hasn't hit the headlines as much, is the fact that the proportion of crimes resulting in a suspect being charged or summoned is now 9%. In 2015, that was 15%. Now, that is an extraordinary collapse. And the Mail also did another poll the other day from Comrades that said 57% of people now think the police have lost control of the streets. We are looking at a situation here where violent crime is surging. 42% of all robberies now are taking place in London, I think, compared to 17% of all crime. So this is an absolute epidemic. This isn't hyperbole that people are sort of making up. The videos that you're seeing now, of machete gangs running around and all the rest of it, this is real. This is what's going on in communities. And I'm afraid, in my opinion, the government and the Conservatives are sending out completely the wrong message when they're saying things like jail is not working. Actually, the prison population is the lowest it's been for 7 or 8 years. I would argue we need a far tougher approach. And yes, you cannot do law and order on the cheap. You've got to have bobbies on the beat, absolutely. But you've also got to have a deterrent. We forgot about that word deterrent. You've got to make prisons, jails, places that people do not want to go. And every single time we see a documentary in this country about our prison conditions, when you see the Americans and people like that comment on YouTube, they think it's an absolute joke. I don't think our prisons, I don't think our deterrent in terms of law and order is anything like strong enough. Hardened criminals, frankly, are going in, they're networking in prison, and they're coming out career criminals. They're not getting that short, sharp shock that they need.
So, I mean, that does move us on to the story on the front page of the Telegraph, which is really interesting, I think. So you've got the Justice Minister saying that jail isn't working. I actually completely agree with him. If you look at what's happened to our prisons over the last 6 or 7 years, you've had independent after independent report coming out saying that these are just, not fit places to live in. They're incredibly dangerous. You've got prison officers at risk in them. You've got drugs being dealt. And actually, if you're putting people into unsafe places, if you're sort of imprisoning them because they've committed crimes and you're putting them into unsafe places, that is not going to do anybody any favours. I think prison can work as a deterrent for the most serious sort of crimes, but I do think one of the really interesting things that David Gauke is saying, which I think the government should be applauded for, is that if you commit a minor offence, we shouldn't be looking at sentences of less than 12 months. We know they don't work. Not only that, they take petty minor criminals, you put them into this really dangerous environment, mixing up with people who committed more serious crimes, and people go out and they're much more likely to reoffend and commit more serious crimes. So short spells in prison don't work. This is, I think, the first time we've seen a Conservative minister really come out and say it this strongly, and I think that is something to be welcomed. But I would say the government has really cut resources to prisons over the last 7 or 8 years, and we've got far fewer prison officers. They are more dangerous places. And you can't say prison doesn't work and we want it to work, we want it to be about rehabilitating people, if you're not prepared to put resources in, if you're literally locking up people in places where drug dealing is rife and you've got rats running around.
He's talking, Michael, about carrots as well as sticks for prisoners, and he cites the example of a prison governor handing out well-done notes to encourage them to behave.
I mean, come on. It's a joke. And having TVs in the cells and all the rest of it, it's a load of rubbish. Look, you've got to go back here to the start of this. I've seen instances, we talk about young kids going around stabbing each other and killing people in London. I've seen instances from police accounts on Twitter where they've said, we've pulled over someone for stop and search, we found them with a hunting knife, and what have we given them? Oh, they've got a little bit of a fine and some community service. The government have just brought out a new policy on acid. We have to get caught twice with acid before you get mandatory sentence. So you just go out of the mentality, I can get away with it once, I have to get to court a second time, I'll just get slapped.
No one's saying that a crime like throwing acid should be
caught with acid. If you're caught with acid, you should go to prison for a couple of years.
But can I just say, I think we need to have some compassion as well. If you look at prisons, who's in prison? A quarter of the prison population will have been at care at some point of their life. We know that having a drug problem or an alcohol dependency,
which is the causes of crime.
No compassion for acid attackers. They ruin people's lives.
I'm not talking about compassion for acid attackers, Michael.
So
I'm talking about people with mental health issues in our prisons. There are people in prison who've been in the care system, who've got serious mental health issues, who've got serious drug dependency. You lock them up in prison, you don't give them access to services that help. That really doesn't help anyone. It massively increases the cost for the state. It makes them more likely to go out and reoffend. So you've got to have some compassion as well. Absolutely, prison should be a deterrent, but it should also be about rehabilitating people and helping people who regret their crimes get their lives back on track. It absolutely isn't at the moment.
It's quite a departure for the Conservative Party, but David Gauke saying that actually he feels he has the backing of the rest of the party for this approach, this rehabilitation approach.
Well, I'm sorry, I think it's going to be enormously unpopular. As I said, there was a poll done the other day, 57% of people think the police have lost control of the streets, and the Conservatives are coming out and say, well, prison
but we haven't got room in our prisons, have we?
Build more prisons then, invest in it.
And actually numbers have gone up.
You've got to invest in these things. You cannot do law and order on the cheap. You need policing, you need neighbourhood policing. It's not good enough excuse to turn around and say, well, we've got to let little Johnny off for acid attacking someone because we've not got enough room in the prisons. It's absolutely pathetic. And there should be a mandatory sentence for anyone caught with a knife with acid of years. No questions asked.
But where do you find the prison places for that then?
We've got to build prisons quickly. Clearly. We've got violent crime going up across the board. If something is badly wrong. Our prison population is the lowest it has been for 7 or 8 years. That tells you a lot.
You also need to make sure that you, for people who've committed minor offences, we've got lots of women in prison as well for minor offences. You don't put them in prison for sentences of less than 12 months. Actually, if you stop doing that, if you do what David Gauke is suggesting here, you would really bring down the prison population. It's not true that the prison population is massively lower than it used to.
It's 7 or 8 year low, and we've got violent crime crime up across the board. There's a correlation there.
You've still got well over 70,000, around 70 to 80,000 people in prison. It's not lower than it used to be. That's just not right.
7 or 8 years low.
But the way you free up more space in prison, the way you make our prisons better quality, is by making sure that you're not locking up people who've committed very minor offences.
But is this all about budget
cuts? At the moment. Well, this is absolutely partly about, the prison's budget has been obliterated. We've lost a third of prison officers, some of the most experienced prison officers over the last 7 to 8 years. You can't run a prison system on that basis. You can't have a prison system that rehabilitates people. That's expensive.
But can you rehabilitate them outside if you don't have the money?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about, and it depends on obviously, for serious crimes, people should be doing doing terms.
But they're
in
not.
prison.
That's the problem. They're not.
But for serious crimes, people are being sentenced to prison.
Not people carrying around acid. They're getting off with it, and that's why you leave people using it.
Prison doesn't work. So there's lots of. We're talking about different things here, Michael. Let me just say what I'm going to say.
Violent crime statistics are up across the board. Do you think they should be put in prison?
No, I do. I think people who commit violent crimes.
If you carry a knife, should you go in prison?
Should be in prison.
If you carry a knife, should you go in prison? I think you should.
And that already happens. That's why we've got high prison numbers.
They get a slap on the wrist.
It does happen.
We've got 7 or 8 year low prison population.
The key thing is that prison doesn't work for people who've committed minor offences, and we are looking up
minor
people.
Offence? What are you classing that as?
For things like shoplifting, we are looking up people who've committed minor offences where actually it would work much better to give them a community sentence on the outside and give them access to services that might help them get their lives back on track.
I just want to bring it. I just want us to look at one more story before we go to the break, because there is a really interesting story in the Express. This picture here at page 3 of the Express, the big breakfast scramble, and this is a queue of parents starting at 3 a.m. and this is all to get their kids into breakfast club.
Apparently someone there from 1 a.m. I mean, that must be one hell of a breakfast, is all I can say, to be motivated. But apparently they had crisps and biscuits in the line. So always, some people jumping on the breakfast.
I think probably a lot of parents will identify with this. So it can be really hard if you're a working parent, you really need to be able to drop your kid off at school early. And sometimes breakfast club places at schools can be very limited. This is a primary school in Wales. It's got 400 pupils and there are only 150 places at the breakfast club. So this is why parents have been spending, there's an annual once a year sign up. And this is why you're seeing these long queues that you sort of might be more likely to see at Royal Wedding or outside Wimbledon. So I think, what it raises is actually most people are working parents these days. We all need, they all need access to breakfast clubs. So what the government should be doing is funding this sort of provision, wraparound provision from earlier in the morning for all pupils. It shouldn't be random and whether you're able to, stand in a queue from 3 a.m. As to whether your kid gets into the school breakfast club or not.
Yeah, it's a tradition been going on a few years, and they've decided it's the fairest way to do it. But only 150 places. So
probably the poorest kids should be entitled to it, though.
Yeah, I actually agree with that.
If you get people pushing in that can afford to pay for it, why is the state paying for that? Ridiculous.
OK, let's take a short break, because coming up, we want to talk about leave meaning leave, why the Mirror is upset that Boris Johnson hasn't yet moved out of the Foreign Secretary's official flat.